Okay, I've been asked to moderate the session on the Open Indicators Consortium and open source data and collaborative learning communities. It's a long day. My name is Jim Farnam with the Connecticut Data Collaborative and Farnam Associates. And I've been a member and early founding member of the Open Indicators Consortium, our project with 6 other sites, now grown to 15 sites. And we're here today to just talk about the process of open source development. We have some great panelists, and we have some discussion questions, but I think it's going to be a conversation. I don't think we have any presentations, right? So it's basically...
We might demonstrate some things on the web.
Okay. So I think what I'd like to do is ask people to introduce themselves and a little bit about what brings them here, and then we'll launch right in. And Holly, do you want to kick off the first sort of... Do people want to give little talks before we get into...
Sure.
Questions?
Sure,
Yeah.
if you want to start.
Yeah. We can, okay.
Let's introduce the names, and then
Okay.
we'll start with Nick to kick it off as a, sort of just to frame the discussion.
Okay. Hi, I'm Nick Grossman, Director of Civic Commons, which is a nonprofit effort to help government and civic organizations make use of open source and open data practices, and we work nationally and internationally.
Holly St. Clair, Director of Data Services at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and I think you all know what I do by now.
I'm George Grinstein from the Computer Science Department at UMass Lowell, and leading the Weave software development, architecting, and visions for the future.
I'm Christian Spanring. I work as developer in Holly's team at MAPC.
Okay, I think, and we're really just trying to get into what is, how does the open source development process work? How do people come together, and what are some of the dynamics of it? So in case any of you are, getting involved in one of these projects or interested in starting one, what's involved and what are some of the ups and downs and especially the incredibly dynamic aspects of it. So we'll start off with Nick from his work helping support open source projects from Civic Commons.
Okay. So I'm just curious, for starters, who in the audience has worked in and on or around open source projects? Okay. Any people thinking about doing that in the near future? Anybody working on a project that should be open source but isn't? Okay. Anybody working, if you're in government, on that you're dealing with a proprietary system that is not good and you wish there was an open source alternative? Okay. Okay, good. So I guess, so I've worked for the past 5 years building businesses that support open source software in the public sector primarily. We do a lot of work. We've done a lot of work with public transit agencies, with city governments, and all different kinds of government entities to help them do open source development, procure for open source development, find contractors like ourselves and others to do the work and build open source practices into their own development process. And so broadly there's sort of a different culture around open software projects than you have in normal commercial public sector or commercial software development process, and it's about doing things out in the open. There's a whole set of practices that kind of flow from the process of being open, but the basic premise is that many eyes make all bugs shallow. When you work out in public, you open the opportunity for people to see into what you're doing, catch mistakes. Working in public sort of forces you into a set of best practices early on that are actually good for the code, even if no one else ever uses it. But it's a really big cultural shift from a sort of day-to-day software development cycle that's not open source. And so I don't know, all of my work has basically been working with governments to help get these kinds of processes in place. And I've got a lot of specifics that we can talk about in terms of the process and what I've seen out there across the country in different parts of the world. Also, I'd just like to say congrats to the OIC team and Weave for going open and releasing. It's really exciting. It looks spectacular. I know you guys have put a ton of work into it, so congrats.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, maybe we'll hear from George. Another one of our sort of thought questions here is what are the limitations for an academic partner as they consider open source? And that we, early on, and we had sort of a, what I would call sort of a quasi-open source approach. It was always going to be open, but then we were talking about charging for certain, certain users, corporate users, private for-profit users, but then in the end, the decision was made, at and with UMass Lowell to go fully open source. So George.
Sure. So I had lots of experience developing visualization systems and tools. This Weave is the 5th generation system we've built. It's one that's basically web-based as opposed to the other ones being desktop-based. And when I was approached, I had a vision of effectively having visualization and data available to anybody. I thought that that's probably the biggest problem we have with a lot of organizations, and if you make data available, because it was the age of data.gov and so on, moving out, getting data out, the problem is the data is in spreadsheets or PDFs files or things like that, and one just has to look at that. You can't visually see a table of data and have a sense of what's going on. So I thought, maybe it's the right time. However, how do you raise money to build something like that? And clearly, if you keep it proprietary from the point of view of the commercial side, you might be able to get large corporations pay a license fee, but make it freely available to the public. So the first year and a half of Weave development, this was the model, and I felt comfortable with that, and so did the university, because the university had spent lots of money on patents that we had embedded and technology and so on. Okay. One of the beautiful things about developing open source is that you think that there are lots of people participating and helping design it. The problem in reality is that if you have too many people participating, you go nowhere. We were very lucky in that we had roughly 7 to 15 members at different stages, and that's actually a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations, a lot of different requirements, but it's handleable. 100 would not at the beginning stages, because how do you prioritize? What do you identify as more important than others? With 15, you can reach consensus generally. 10 or 12 will say this is really important. We have a technical vision of understanding what the ramifications are, so the matches were fairly easy. So this was a quasi-open source development activity for the past 3 years. All right? Does everybody understand? That's very, very different than a fully open source model where everybody participates. Okay. During the last year, one of the decisions we made is to go fully open source. The reason for that was issues about, will UMass Lowell continue to be around? Will we do it? What are the advantages? And with Nick and Carl Fogel and others, I began seeing that that's probably the wave of the future. It makes a lot of sense to not have any restrictions whatsoever. And the problem was convincing a university that has invested money, that's, as you know, most universities now look for grants and money and licensing as a key factor. And so this is sort of an issue that has to be addressed. The way I convinced them, it was very simple. I think the PR that we're going to get is very high. And second, I haven't had much success licensing technology in the past. Okay? So what I did get were contracts, but never managed to get somebody to come over and pay a percentage for technology that we had intellectual property. So it made a lot of sense. Okay, so the university buys it. We're all set. We now have an open source package. Now it is truly open source. People can download it, make code suggestions, play with it. And so we'll see what happens over the next few years, and I expect to have to build an organization to continue to maintain that. Why? Because open source software, even though one can think that it's free, it isn't. Somebody has to maintain the code. You can't just, if you're running, for example, in the police department, you can't have ads pop up all of a sudden. You can't have someone have a back door that they've written into the code, so someone has to monitor and continually read every piece of code that's going to be embedded into the software and released. So there has to be a moderating organization. There has to be funding to continue to fix bugs as they appear and to work with others. So it isn't free, but we expect that we'll get grants to continue maintaining it from different organizations. People may want some pieces of software to be written, and so they'll provide some funding for that to happen. The consortium itself is supporting each other and coming up with additional monies to fund some of the students. And then the beauty of the learning community that comes in is that that learning community, which are the consortium members, the developers, share ideas in an open fashion so that anyone else can read that as well, helping us, the developers, solve problems ahead of time. So they'll have workarounds on certain things that we won't have the time to be able to do. That's really, really nice. When I read a particular bug and I say, all right, we'll have to work on that, this is a deep one and all that, and then Christian says, well, I have a workaround, here's what you can do, and great, it's done. Okay, we still have to somehow think about what the architectural ramifications are, but at least there's a workaround so people can get to do things. That's the value of the open source community.
And I think Holly was going to go next. She has some perspective on this.
Yeah, so this panel is meant to be a conversation because I think one of the things I was interested in helping people understand is that becoming open source or participating in an open source project is a process, and there's often competing interests, competing perspectives, and those are all things that are important to keep in mind as you're trying to build something that's successful, and you have to balance each of those. And I think that was something. When you start on a software project, you think you're building a machine, like code. You don't really think about the other political, social aspects that are so obvious at a certain point. Like, why did we not think of that? But, and so I just wanted to talk at this panel a little bit, and you're starting to hear some of it come out, about the different perspectives and things we're trying to balance when we start an open source software project. And so, you know, George clearly had his institutional and educational goals and responsibilities he needed to balance. I think from MAPC's perspective as a government agency, you know, we come from an era when we're really emphasizing transparency, collaborative decision-making with our communities, and yet most of the tools we use, most of the software is not built that way. We were spending a lot of money going to proprietary software that we had no control over the development priorities. And we really just felt that if we were going to invest public dollars in something, it really needed to be something that the public had access to, not necessarily owned, but had access to, that was unfettered. And so one of the interesting pieces I thought that was one of our first, I think, challenges as we began to sort of create this vision, excuse me, this vision together, was some of us used the term open source, but we all had different definitions, which is something that was amazing to me and amazing to others. So I think one of the first things that you really need to make sure when you're starting an open source project is that you all have a consistent definition of open source. In the case, I would probably recommend the open source, OSI, what is it? Open source initiative. The open source initiative, as I went on this learning path with Christian over the past year with Carl and Nick's guidance. I think Nick's trying to pull it up for me. The open source initiative is a great resource that defines what open source is, what are the criteria you need to make it open source. It helps you define the different licenses that are available. And once we were able to get a common definition, we were able to then look at some of the different licensing within open source, which I'm not going to get too into because I'm not very versed in it yet. But we were able to go through and think about different licenses that would help balance each of the needs and interests of the different consortium partners. I think that's just the overview and the response I wanted to give.
And just, this is open source, isn't it?
Yep.
This is, I think, right?
Yeah.
So this is the, I think you can get it on your Civic Commons website. It's basically Carl Fogel, who was a key advisor to us in the process of thinking it all through, wrote the book on producing open source software. So it's a whole roadmap and guide, at least from his perspective, of how you organize these things.
Yeah, my colleague Carl worked with the Weave team, and he's great, producing-oss.com if you want to read the book.
And I wanted to ask Christian from the sort of the developer's perspective, as someone who was, you know, from our earliest in-person meetings of the collaborative, is very clear about what he thought we should do, and just if you have perspectives on this from your experience here.
No, I just want to underline what Holly said. From our perspective, like buying into a new piece of software that we are going to adopt and to make a key part of our own data portal, I think the risk for us was just too high to buy into a proprietary tool with the risk. What happens if UMass Lowell changes the focus of their research and sort of stops building this tool, stops maintaining this tool, what happens afterwards? What are we doing? And open source is basically the guarantee for us that this tool will survive as long as there is one user out there in the world who is interested in using this software. The code will survive and the product will be alive, and we can use it. And if the key partner, UMass Lowell in this case, drops the ball on the project, an open source license allows us to come in, maybe to raise funding or to take over the codes, to hire a development team, and to make the software what we want of it.
Just to be clear, we're very happy that UMass Lowell is taking the leadership position, and the students are doing an excellent job. But I think you have to be careful when you make a large investment.
And in one of my earliest meetings in Connecticut to consider this, and we were lucky to have some early investors in our share, and we put in, each of the first 7 partners put in $150,000, which in those 2-3 years ago was not a small amount of money. And we could have gone to buy a commercial product to do some fraction of what we've done on the web for $10,000, but with ongoing licensing fees and all that. But it just never, it really was, there was a leap of faith aspect of that. That's where Charlotte was instrumental in sort of getting us all, really one by one, talking to all the different potential partners, and with George and Bill Mass and Holly, just saying there's a leap of faith aspect here, and I think that leap of faith is being rewarded now. But I was in meetings that I was reminded that our Department of Information Technology for the state of Connecticut does not allow open source software on a state server, period. No open source is allowed as a matter of state policy back then. Now they're reviewing that. But so we had a lot of people saying this is like a risky track to go on. Why are you going this way? And I think we also saw what had happened to Boston, MAPC, and Columbus, Ohio. Our partner would bought another proprietary system, and then the owner just said, well, geez, we're not supporting it anymore, but you can buy my Model Z for another investment of 6 figures, or sorry, and that's what none of us want to ever face again. So that's from a business sort of management perspective as a partner here. I think that's what tipped us over the edge, and is keeping us there. It's just this, because I think it is bearing the fruit that we wanted it to.
Oh, I can go wherever. Yeah. Do you want to go into the questions, or do you want?
I think George just started. Jim started to work through the questions.
Yeah, so we have sort of worked through some of them. I think we talked with Christian. I think the best practices. I think that's where Nick. What are some of the best practices for open source projects to consider? Maybe go into that.
Sure. Sure. I think I can probably talk about the best practices a little bit, and also talk about some of the common concerns and misconceptions and fears that you get when you go into an open source project. And a lot of this came up at the beginning when we first started talking about open source. And for those of you who haven't, may not be working in this every day, the idea of an open source project is that the source code is published somewhere, and people can see it, they can inspect it, they can make a copy of it, they can tinker with it. But that doesn't mean that people have access to the source code that's running on your own computer, right, on your own website. It also doesn't mean that anybody can contribute back to that unless you allow them to. So there is control. And then one of the other, the biggest concerns that always tends to come up is about commercializing open source, and the distinction between free software and commercial software. And what you're seeing now is lots and lots of businesses that are built up around open source software. So something like 80% of every website in the world is running on open source software on the inside. And when it comes to open source applications, you're starting to see a new breed of companies that is sprouting up around to support open source applications. And bringing in commercial partners from the beginning is actually a really important step. I guess if you want to talk about best practices, really the most important thing when you get to start doing an open source project is to work out in public. And there's a certain sort of common set of infrastructure that comes with every open source project that includes a code repository and a mailing list where discussions are happening about the project, and a bug tracker where problems are getting reported, and all this is happening out in the public. And even if it's just your team working on it together, what you do is you sort of imagine that there's a wider community there that you're not talking, you know, in back channels. And so if you can imagine that there's a community, then a community will sprout up over time, and we've seen that happen over again. Another important aspect when starting an open source project is to open as early as possible. So there's always a common desire or with projects that are getting going to say, well, we'll open source it in a year, we'll open source it in 2 years. And we recommend folks always open as early as they can, because the longer you start working in a closed way, the harder it is to undo that. From trivial things like people leave comments in the code that may say something like, oh, I just hacked this together, you know, blah, 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 blah. And like programmers understand what that means, but when that's, you know, visible to the public, it can be embarrassing, or things like passwords getting saved. And all these things happen when you work in a closed way, and so we encourage people to open from the beginning if you're going to open. And then another one is to use the standard licenses. So if you look at and standard practices. So the Open Source Initiative is a nonprofit group that sponsors a set of licenses that are standard across all open source projects, across many open source projects. And when you use one of those licenses, any developer who's thinking about using your code or building off of your code, they can look at it and understand what that means, because it's one of the standard licenses, as opposed to developing a custom license. And then I think the last and one of the more complicated things that always comes up around open source is how to protect your business interests and direct the potential development around an open source product. So one of the things we talked about at the very beginning with Weave was, you know, what if some big co wraps this up in a proprietary package and then starts making billions of dollars off of it, and we never see any of that coming back to us, which is a perfectly reasonable question to have. And this situation is addressed at lots of places in open source, and one technique that is used to do that is something called dual licensing approach, where you can you can charge someone for a commercial license, or you can let them have a very, very open source license, which then restricts their ability to sort of box it up and package it. And so we talked through a lot of that stuff at the beginning of Weave, and you know, there are complex questions that touch business goals and community and team goals and working relationships. And what we do at Civic Commons is try and provide support for making these decisions along the way. One thing that's worth noting about Weave, as it related to like the larger world of open source, is that there's sort of a spectrum of formality when it comes to open source projects, right? So I could go write a little something and post it on the web and slap a license on it, and it's open source. And I can do that as an individual or as a company or as a government. And then there's a whole spectrum of formality over towards the actual consortia, like OIC, that comes into a project with a stated intention and a stated partnership, and develops those relationships up front. And so it's a very interesting case study in what you guys have done to make the organized, formalized partnership work and balance all of your interests. And so I guess the point I would like to make is that open source doesn't have to be that formal, but it can be in places where people are putting money on the table, and those relationships being defined relative to one another are very important. But it can also be much lower effort if you just want to get started with something open source in more of a casual way.
So let me just add one thing related to that. So the end result license that we picked, because I think that'll give you an example of what our approach was that most of Weave, pretty much all the core of Weave, is an open source license that if anyone does any modifications to the code, then, or additions to that part of the code, they have to provide it back to Weave. Okay, so if IBM or any other corporation decides they're going to create a new visualizations within the core code and attach it to the core, then that code becomes part of Weave, which helps Weave grow. So that's very, very nice. Now, what if IBM would like to develop a proprietary application sitting on top of the core? So we have a license for using the application programmer interface, in particular case, the MPL, the Mozilla Public License. And that allows someone to just use the API and build something proprietary. Why is that important to us? Because there are corporations that would like to potentially build something very proprietary, potentially embedded in a medical device or something else to make money. But then they would use the core, and they would have a vested interest in making sure that the core is continually maintained, at the same time could make money off theirs. And those that don't, that just use the core code or the API with no changes, would feel comfortable because that is completely open source. So it's a little bit of a balance between the two, being sensitive to the fact that some corporations want to make money off software.
So I'm just wondering, with this license agreement that you're suggesting here, how do you make sure that if a corporation is using, let's say they have the proprietary API and they also have your base code and they're doing changes to that base code,
so there's
they're keeping all their base code and not pushing anything back.
Right. So in some fashion, are you asking how do we monitor this, or?
Right, I mean, monitor, and also, I mean, is the expectation is if they're making changes to the core code.
They technically have to give it back, and if they don't, they're in violation of the licensing agreement. So the question is, would anyone follow it or not? Actually, that's very hard to do. So what typically would happen is that the maintenance aspect then becomes, to maintain that core code that they've changed is their responsibility, their pressure, and if there's a bug in there that relates to our bug, then we would ask that we see the code that it runs to be able to reproduce it, which means we would see the changes and they would be present. So they would likely not come back to us for us to fix core technology. So it's twofold. One, there is a way potentially for us to be able to check that. Not that university is not going to go sue or anybody like that, but I think it's a trust aspect. Part of it is if most people would sort of be very happy with letting the code continue and evolve, whereas they would focus on their application that's sitting on top, which is their responsibility to maintain.
Question over here.
I wanted to ask for Weave, but also other open source projects, what are the governance model for determining the core kernel? I mean, I understand under certain licensing you can sort of cleave it off and there would be like another variety, but how are you making decisions about what changes are made, and then how do, like, what about Linux and these other ones? I heard about it, but I don't know.
I think George can talk about Weave, and then Nick can talk about.
Sure. So users participate in deciding what features get implemented under which priority. So we have a list of features, requests that come from the consortium members. Our research lab has feature requests as part of research or thesis activities and so on. The consortium members vote on those, prioritize them, identify this one is urgent, I need this within a month, and we then look at the architecture and decide on which ones can be done, dependency aspects, and we go ahead and build those. Some consortium members have a particular aspect that they want that the other consortium members are not interested. So some of them have come up with additional funds for us to be able to push this further.
Yeah, sure. And governance happens differently in every open source project. So in some of the more formal consortia, like Weave, another one that's very popular in academia is called Kuali. And this is a whole suite of open source software that is for the management of administration systems for higher education. There's a similar consortia there where there's a membership model, and depending on how it's set up, you pay a membership fee, and then that buys you some amount of governing rights on a project, and it could happen on a sub-project basis or so on. That's a very formal model. There are also more casual models. This is a project called Open Trip Planner that we work on at Open Plans, and each of these colored lines is someone's commits, so edits that have been made to the project, and the black line is the quote-unquote trunk. And this project doesn't have a formal governance structure, but there is one person who has the quote-unquote pull rights back into the master repository. So if you want to get your changes back into that, you have to convince the project owner.
So that
Yeah.
person literally has the only one permission to change that black line.
That's right. So if I can,
So sort of the benevolent despot model.
yeah, benevolent dictator, and that's Linus Torvalds is the benevolent dictator for life of Linux. And so there's a sort of a wide range. Many projects have an official steering committee. If it's not as formal as an actual consortia like within Weave that that controls incoming requests. I mean, one of the things that's really neat about the way open source is happening right now is that anybody can take the code and go off and do with it what they want. In the old days, the big risk was that if you took a piece of code and forked it, meaning copied the repository and made your own changes over here, that it would be hard to get those changes back into the main trunk. And just due to some technical considerations about how version control is done now with distributed version control, it's much easier to do that. Forking is much more encouraged. It's a much looser system of management, and you'll see a lot of projects. This is a website called GitHub where people post code that they've written, get forked 10, 20, 30 times, and activity can happen on one fork where one person controls that fork, or it could happen on another fork where another person controls that fork. And if I wanted to if those people didn't agree about a feature and therefore didn't want to integrate each other's features into one branch, I could start my own and pull the part I wanted from one and pull the other part that I wanted from the other, very easily do that. And so there's a very distributed model now that's possible with managing the development of open source projects. Clearly, for the long-term stability and strength of a project, you do want to centralize and create more formal structures for managing this kinds of things over time, but it doesn't have to start that way.
I think, from my perspective, when we had these discussions, one thing that does hold us all together and keep us civil with each other is that we all know that a group of us could just break off, take the code, and go over here and create a fork, like what happened with OpenOffice. I forget the company, but they lost control of it because they were not taking care of their users, and the users went off and said, screw you, we're going to create LibreOffice, and now LibreOffice, and then the other one dropped OpenOffice support. So now LibreOffice is the model. And there's no prospect of that happening here, but that's sort of keeps us all working closely together. And you had a question down here? Did you? Or no?
Wait.
The private sector acquiring companies are often really scared that they may be picking up something that has proprietary origin that the seller doesn't reveal. Is that an issue for you? Do you have to run code libraries against contributions to the open source so that you make sure that it kind of stays pure?
George?
So we've tried to, with the help of Carl and Nick, identify what dependencies there are, and at this point there are none. All the code is written by us, or if we use it, we've made sure that either we call and the other library has the capabilities of doing that. In many cases, some of the libraries have to be, like MySQL, might have to be downloaded separately, may not be puttable on the same disk. So any of those things have been looked at pretty closely as we are evaluating the kind of open source model licenses that we can have. And Andy can add, do you have anything to add related to that, Andy? Pardon me? Okay. But the key aspect is that you do have to look at that in terms, you're calling a library, you're using a transport mechanism, you all of a sudden use a piece of open source code that is compiled, you haven't looked at it. And so you really have to check the licenses of those objects to make sure that they match what you're trying to do.
Made a tremendous contribution.
I'm sorry?
Because you've made a tremendous contribution in the beginning. You want to protect the...
Right, and so we're making sure of that continually. Every time we use something, that question pops up. Is it our code? Are we using an open source library? How are we allowing to do that? And Andy described that we're building a plug-in architecture, which will help with that as well. So the goal is to make sure that whatever packages you have that you want to plug with Weave, you'll understand clearly how to tie it in.
I've often wondered, though, for what about not the code, but the idea? like when I look at Gapminder, I say, I want that in Weave. If you just go and replicate a feature of Gapminder in Weave, is there a danger that it might have been protected over in
So,
Gapminder?
the question here is, are there potential patents or intellectual property is not an issue, but patents where somebody patent a particular user interface technique or an algorithm within the code? The answer is yes. That's always a possibility, that you just replicate something without knowing that somebody else has a patent on it. One of the advantages we have is that we've been building visualization systems for 20 years. And so a lot of what we're doing was done in previous ones. So if anybody ever comes with a particular patent on something, I'd be ready to say, wait a minute, we built something like that in one of our early systems. But it is possible. However, let me emphasize that if that were to happen, we probably would do a write around that code and start changing it. And it's very likely that whoever's doing it would probably not want to get embarrassed with a lawsuit with not-for-profit organizations, which is one of the advantages.
And the issue of making sure your licenses are all compatible moving forward is another one of the reasons why we suggest to go open from as early as possible, because then every time you're integrating something new, you're thinking in mind, okay, is this compatible with the license that the rest of our packages is already licensed under, as opposed to having written a whole bunch of stuff and then get ready to open it and you're like, okay, now we need to go back and do a reverse inventory of everything that was ever written and figured out. You can do that, but it's harder. And then the question about patents is an important question for all software development, not specific to open source, right? And business method patents and software patents are difficult to deal with. I was going to say they're crappy, but they're difficult to deal with, but that's not specific to open source.
One question we had thought of is, if anyone, I think a couple of you were interested in starting an open source project, how do you get going? How do you get an open source developer on board? And Christian was suggesting might have some ideas about that.
Well, the question just came up earlier in another session too. Well, the first thing is open source if you're looking for people, it's just part of a regular job description. You probably want people who are familiar in open source environment, dealing with mailing lists, getting some ported information out of mailing lists, for instance, or from IRC chats, know how to deal with public code repositories. That all could be part of a regular job description. If you are trying to meet people there, I mean, especially here in the Boston area, there's a large tech scene. There are hundreds of tech meetups. Meetup.com is a great resource to look if you have really a certain type of problem to solve, or you're trying to apply a certain technology. There is probably a meetup group for that, and it's often the case that before meetup group starts, there you can go in front of the crowd and basically make your job post. But it's nothing really different from hiring a proprietary, I don't know, .NET developer or something. The other part is GitHub was mentioned. GitHub is currently, it has evolved as the go-to resource for open source projects. If you see an open source project there, just look at the GitHub commits, who participates. You have the full documentation of who submitted what piece of code there, who are the people behind, and what other projects are they involved. You get basically developer profiles. Their developers are building their resume on GitHub, basically. Go to GitHub, look people up, contact them. Maybe they can help you out.
Yeah, I'll second that. Being someone who works in the software industry, we do all of our hiring through open source now. So I was talking to someone the other day. He was interested in coming to work for one of our organizations, and he said, well, what's the best way for me to do that? I said, well, you should just start participating in the open source, because then we'll see you and then we'll notice you. And that's how these communities happen, not just for puppy dogs and rainbows and happy fuzzies, but also for real jobs.
I think Holly, who was instrumental in the formation of some of my views of this, I mean, kept talking about the ecosystem, developing the ecosystem around the project. And I think we're still in the early stages of that. Our ecosystem is not, but the ecosystem is all the companies who want to use it, the code developers at different universities. So that's what the ultimate goal is to develop So people, some people are making a living off it, some people are making money off it. Everyone is, contributing to the project. And I think an example of that, recently we came across a programmer at a nonprofit in Chicago who Carl, I guess, introduced me to from MCIC, and he was just raving about Weave. And we'd never heard of him. George had never heard. He never called up, talked to anyone. But one of our consortium members is in Chicago, and he had gotten some help from them. But he had downloaded himself. He was working on it, already integrated into 2 major projects. So we now have that's the beginning in this sort of nonprofit data community of people just picking it up on their own. And we want to see hundreds of those happening, especially when we get the version that's going to be easy to upload and easy to use. It'll get much more play.
I'll just add one example to that. I worked on a project starting in 2009 called the Open Trip Planner, which was an open source routing engine that transit agencies use, and we developed it with Portland, Oregon's transit agency. And it's been in development for the past 2 years. It just launched on the Portland TriMet website in the fall. But while we were building it, people started downloading the code and using it in other places. And so this is it in New York City. This is it in Pune, India. This is it in Tel Aviv. There's more New York. And so before we had even finished the project and deployed it for the initial client that we were working on it with, it'd been deployed in 7 countries and supported by 3 different independent companies. And we weren't, and that's amazing. And you hear these stories every once in a while, like, oh yeah, I downloaded this and now I'm using it, and it's just like wonderful.
Yeah. How much inquiry have you had of that nature?
In some ways, not as many, simply because it is a server-based system, and so it takes people a little more expertise to download, and I'm very glad. But I think that within the next, because of today, I expect to have lots of emails and calls, and my students will be very happy to help people out. Question there.
Yeah, question?
Have a number of projects that are happening at the university in the local community. And so over time, it has become so that the community has experienced research fatigue because, of course, we are extracting the data, but the data is not translating back into the community in a usable fashion to the community itself. And so one of the challenges that we've had is how do we centralize all the data that we have in the various projects in a way that would make it actually usable to the community. So the best scenario that we have come up with so far is just a repository where we can place our data using a Creative Commons license for, I'm not remembering the engine that we're using. But is there another way that you would recommend where we could centralize all that data and make it more usable to the community?
Well, the data aspect, Holly should talk about. Then I can add the fact that by making Weave available with that data set as it's done here, would provide the community access to all of that data in a much more facile manner. But I'll take it one step further. I just want to add that currently, for example, in Weave, if you look, and in fact in all the browsers that people have it, if you look, everything's in English. And one of the things that we're going to do over the next probably year is build language interfaces so that all you have to do is point a link to the particular language that you want every menu selection to be in to start building that. But that'll be for Weave. The web browsers themselves, probably whatever site does that, should have that capability itself of being internationalized. And I think many of the places that are building websites are thinking about it, thinking maybe of 2-3 languages, but not enough, but full internationalization is one of the way. And we're also working on ADA compliance, American Disability Act compliance. And that's an interesting question when you think about how do you make an interactive visualization work ADA compliant? And the answer is it's doable, it's interesting, it's a great research topic, and I hope that within 2 years we'll have that completely solved and delivered.
One suggestion that's probably obvious, but I must say it, is of course to store it on the data common. one of the things I did not mention in my demonstration was that we have DataCommon affiliates. We're almost similar to Jim's portals, where we'll spin out a version of the DataCommon. So there's a Chinatown DataCommon, there's a, I think the Somerville DataCommon, there's also a Mystic River DataCommon. We'll spin out a version of it where we still store all the data in a central repository at MAPC, but we make it available in a particular packaging for a particular issue area. I think one thing that you may want to consider, if you, of course, don't go with us, is to make sure that when you do create that central repository, to look into web feature services and web mapping services, because really, I think the idea of being able to serve up data and information through web feature services so that servers can directly call the information from each other and allow, for example, the DataCommon then to pull the data from your repository into our repository for our users is really a great idea.
Other questions?
I was just going to say, I think one of the other myths or one of the challenges, I think from a management point of view, is sometimes people say open source and people who are not close to it just hear free. There's no licensing, it's free, which is true, but there's still staff and staffing costs or programming costs. There's still a cost to sort of maintain, implement, and program the code itself or install what you're doing. And so it's just something to keep in mind as you're project managing. You know, we already talked about transparency of decision-making process, which is one of the transitions that's hard when you're managing a project, to go from talking to 2 or 3 people who are your leaders in your community to talking about everything in an open way, not trying to network and just put it together, but really just being transparent about decision-making. The second one is, you know, thinking about what your costs will be and then how to make it sustainable, which George talked a little bit about the perspective from an academic institution. And then I think the third one is really just being responsive to your users in a way that I think if you own the proprietary code, I feel like you're not under as much responsibility. I mean, to a certain degree you are, because people are voting with their dollars. But if no one uses your platform and no one contributes to the code, it really can become outdated quickly. And part of the business model and sustainability model of this is that we'll have more contributors. And so that sort of feeds into it and helps it be a more robust and sustainable tool.
Yeah, and the commercial partnerships are actually a big part of that too. So the open source project that I've been a part of in public sector often have a commercial partner or 2 from the beginning who work with the public entity to create that and then create their own business opportunity at the same time. So I mentioned the Quali project, which is the academia one. One of the founding members of the Quali Foundation was a corporate partner that services the Quali platform, and now they have 100 employees and they service like 30 universities. And so the sustainability includes funding the active development and then also creating an ecosystem of users, contributors, and businesses.
Yeah. Sure.
Hi, my question relates exactly to that. I hope you didn't cover this before I came in, but with corporate partners that are growing, and you just gave the example of putting open source out there and then a particular community all over the world buying in and using that. Suppose you, with your corporate partners, without getting into a discussion in licensing, I mean, these guys are bringing money into the project, so new places are springing up and bringing new corporate partners. Who owns that? How does that work? How do you make sure that everyone is contributing, and is there some central, is it a pot that everybody kicks into? How does the money work?
It happens differently in every project, and I'll let you guys talk about how Weave works. In the case of Quali, which is another very formal model, there are membership fees, and the amount that you pay determines your voting rights, basically. It's not quite that straightforward because you have small institutions working with large institutions, and the commercial partners pay to be part of that foundation as well, and then also can get paid to do the work. In the case of, say, the Open Trip Planner project, this is a much less formal project where the code is owned by the contributors. So everybody owns the copyright to the piece that they've put in, and it's licensed under the GPL license, which is a very restrictive copyleft license, which means that it's going to stay open source no matter what. There are there are middle grounds where, for instance, MySQL, which is a very popular open source database, every line of code that's ever been committed to the MySQL project the copyright has been transferred to the company that owns it, and that gives them the right to do some creative things with how it's licensed. So they license it under a copyleft GPL license, and they also offer it under a permissive commercial license. But you can only do that if you own the copyright all the way up and down. So, it depends, and it's worth, as you embark on any of this, just sort of talk through with someone with experience in it, and there's lots of lawyers and technologists who get this stuff to make sure that you're going to be able to do the things that you want to do with the project.
In that case, does a company that created MySQL, how do they prevent someone just branching off and dropping their version?
They don't.
Yeah, and that would be a fork, and that would probably be a stupid thing to do because then you're not going to get, then
upgrades.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are social pressures and practical pressures that prevent these kinds of things.
In the case of Weave, the Open Indicators Consortium has different levels of membership. At the top one, for $75,000 one-time fee, you can vote on features and help evolve the software and get some support. Then there's a lower value, and then there's a really inexpensive one at about $1,000 or $2,000 or something, $500. Very, very low, where you just participate in the learning community and are able to attend, I think, the annual conference that will start this fall, I think, and be open to other individuals that will be charged for that. So we're trying to build some form of a tier, and then we work on grants to continue the support activity of the continued development activity of the software.
I just wanted to as you can tell already, it's a wide-ranging topic, and I just want to really thank Civic Commons and Nick Grossman and Carl Fogel for helping us, because they were able to come in and talk and answer all of our questions from the lawyers at UMass and our individual organizations. They were able to tap a patent lawyer to come in and really check into some of that and help us understand what's happening. They're able to talk to the coders, talk about the code and what needs to happen, how to manage it. They're able to talk to some of us who have no idea what open source is. We just have a goal in mind and a vision and aren't really technical. I mean, just the ability to have the depth and experience and be able to translate all the issues to those different worlds was so critically important. So thank you very much.
Welcome. It's our pleasure.
Okay, well, we have about half an hour left in the session.
Nope.
So, what is it?
5:15. What time is it? Oh, yeah, we do.
So I think the question is, it is getting late. It's been a long day, so we're really here. Now, I guess any of the panelists who have things to say, any additional, have we covered the territory?
Yeah.
And any should we just do a final call for questions, or if anyone wants to throw out their idea for an open source project and have us beat it around a little bit, do that? Or yeah.
Following up on maintenance information, I'm thinking about the data, and what if the data, either you're developing data or you're pulling in data, how do you maintain integrity? How do you make sure the data you're getting is accurate? How do you measure that? Is that part of the consortium?
Actually, I mean, that's really totally separate from the question of Weave and the software, because the data is all the dynamics and politics and everything of the data is outside Weave, because Weave
code has to go toward, has to pull out that data.
Right. So it has to present it honestly and accurately. That's the code's job, but the data intermediary's job is to deliver the data to the code. That's have that responsibility.
So I'll within Weave, there's the capabilities of dealing with metadata, which is information about the data, where it comes from, and so on. And we're evolving that much more with building taxonomies and hopefully eventually an ontology that will support much more semantic information about the data attributes. Where does the data come from, its age, when has it been revised, who are the people involved, and so on. And I think that's an evolving aspect with the consortium members, because most of the consortium members have been focused on getting sites up. They already have data, they have some metadata, and the interoperability between consortium sites where Atlanta and Boston could be looked at together is sort of the next step. So that's what's some of what's going to happen over the next 2 years is these comparative aspects, this aspect of loading the ACS data, the census, the community survey data, and then integrating it with others. And that requires a tremendous amount of information about data, its integrity, how good is it? When did you update it? You know, is this ACS early first quarter, or is this second quarter? Have you put in the fixes and things like that? That has ramifications for the data commons and the people who are storing the data, as well as the end users.
I think, you know, we've had, if you look at our concept papers and online, we've had this concept of a data common, sort of a national data common that we've been working on the concept of since the beginning, and that is still sort of in formative stages. But you know, just the other day, I was talking with our partner in Seattle, the Seattle King County Public Health Department, and we were talking about there's a subset of us really interested in the issues of health equity and how do you present health equity data or data about social determinants in ways that link back to health outcomes. And we were talking about the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey, which is the main source of most of CDC's data about risk factors. And the fact that you can download the entire national data set of every individual response de-identified and I'm not sure exactly what parameters there are in that download, but then, you know, wouldn't it be so effective if all the people interested in health equity all either got a foundation grant or pooled it and paid a team to just, you know, really hone that data up and asking the best questions of it and presenting it through Weave in the most effective ways that we could all then benefit from, rather than right now, I would venture a guess that all 15 sites are going to the census site, picking out the ACS data, which ones are this huge morass of data, pulling down and then winding through. And we've come up with like 1,200 variables that we have on our site out of the thousands available, but we're all doing it independently. And it's just, to me, that it would have been, you know, it's still, for the next years of ACS, we should get to a model where we work together to define it. Just like we're defining Weave for visualization, we should define how we can maximize the utility of ACS data without having to each do it independently.
Right, so just to answer, we are doing that. Okay, the fundamental problem is that we're encountering is that individual OIC members name their fields completely different in many cases. Right. And so that's part of the reason for having an initial taxonomy organizational structure where we are hand mapping, but the goal is to eventually have the consortium members and others adopt standards and then use ontology-based tools to match, so that if there's some things that don't quite match, the administrator can go look at it and say, oh yes, these do, but Texas uses for teenage girls 12 to 15, and Boston uses a different one, which now means that the visualizations have to show that in some fashion the comparisons are somewhat fuzzy. Okay, and so we are going to do that, and that's why there's another 3 years of activity on this also.
Good, Dale.
For the ACS data, why not, I suspect there's slowness issues, but why not do a direct call into the database?
Actually, Rhode Island is doing that. At least Jim told me that when you go to their site to look up ACS variable on the fly, they go to Washington or wherever it is, pull that point out and deliver it to you, right? Is that your understanding?
The data ferret, yeah.
Yeah, but there are other reasons for performance aspects. Okay, one of the goals of Weave, which I didn't state, was 20-second download time and 1-second response time. And so that won't work, but if you want to do that, you can. You could build a system that does that directly. The other aspect is that we're starting to look at different zoom levels and aggregation capabilities, so that as you zoom in, you start looking at county data. As you zoom in, you start looking at smaller neighborhood data, and then eventually lot data. And we want that to be fluid, not just for the US, but for the world. And so that implies automatically that somewhere along the data has had to have been pre-processed for performance, and that means that it's got to be off the census site unless they're willing to do the pre-processing and provide those data files, which is a wonderful possibility. And I have been talking to someone about because they don't have just ACS data, they have lots and lots of other databases. If they would pre-process them in such a way that it falls into the kinds of interactions and merging that the consortium members and others want, then that would be the solution. They would provide the census data as sort of the data commons, and no one else would have to do that. And that makes a lot of sense rather than UMass Lowell or the consortium doing it.
So I'd like, since we're at Data Day and whatnot, and we're talking about open source projects, and I think you were asking if you have any ideas. So thank you. I was just suggesting that since it's Data Day and everything, and we have lots of people here thinking about this problem, at the moment we still have the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems I see with data in general, is that it comes in so many different fashions, and nobody knows, once you've made a copy of this from that website, and then you sent it to somebody else from somewhere else, and nobody has a way of tracking back. There's no canonical information. When I actually had a event, WhereCamp, where this came up over and over again, it's like, there's got to be a canonical thing. How about designing a Git for data?
Exactly.
And I don't know if anybody's starting to work on this project, and if not, this is, it's CouchDB.
No, there's Data Couch, which is, it's like GitHub
So what
and
is-
Google Spreadsheets had a baby.
What does that mean?
It's a versioned tracked data. So one of the Code for America fellows last year made this.
There's also OpenGeo has a project. They're trying to merge Git with, or trying to have the Git approach to web services and version data. So whenever you change something, you can basically roll back to to whatever state of your data.
Pushing out as far as
They are web services people as WFS, for instance.
so
They're the
WFS
choosers.
has to be feature class service that
Yeah, exactly.
only people who know what WFS
Yeah,
is.
versioned.
Okay, I'm just wondering, like, it seems that this is still a big issue, and from your viewpoints, since you guys are all playing with data, is there any direction? Is JSON the direction people are going in, or is something else the direction people are going in? Because it seems silly in this day and age that the portable file format in the geography department is always shapefile, and that's older than my, older than many of my T-shirts, and et cetera. Any thoughts about any
That's a tough
conclusions
one.
currently on the data?
I mean, I think I agree with you. It's the problem. I think you're right on about some sort of GitHub versioning system for data. The one piece that I can't quite tell what I think about it, because I haven't thought enough about it, is that right now we have data intermediaries. We have the data providers, which are usually, in 85% of the cases or so, a government agency who's tracking some administrative data set. And then we have a data intermediary who helps pull that data, clean it, and then interpret it for people who then actually use it on the ground. And I think one of the things we're interested in doing is trying to get rid of all the effort we spend in cleaning data over and over again so that we can just focus on helping to interpret and gain insight. And so I absolutely agree with you. What I can't quite figure out is in that model, like what's the software equivalent? Like I just don't.
Well, have you seen the Google Refine tool, which is another interesting thing where you're cleaning the data, but in the process of cleaning the data, it's creating history for you of what you did to the data, which is
Which
is part of. Yeah. It's not exactly canonical. It doesn't tell us who worked on the data, but it tells us at least what happened to the data when it was sitting there.
So there was this project by Joe Ferreira at MIT about 5 years ago called Middleware. And he had this thing where he puts a facade over the data sets. So you as a data processor will process the data, and it tracks basically the processing that you're doing. And you can assign it, and then it becomes a code that other people can run. They can check your code out, run on a data set. And so, we have been thinking about trying to look at that, but we haven't had a chance to. But it sounds like a similar idea. But in this case, it doesn't actually ever change the data set. The data set's always the original format. You just put the facade of the particular processing code on top of it. So it always maintains the base code, the base data, and you're looking at the different processes that you're laying on top of it.
So it always needs to generate either a cache or something. I mean, otherwise it'd be really slow processing every time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we got to the concern of processing speed in that project at all. I think we were more just working on the concepts, and I think the piece that excited us about that is the idea of trading local knowledge. So, for example, when Harvard was buying up all the land in Alston-Brighton, the Alston-Brighton CDC figured out all the different partnership names that Harvard was secretly buying up land under. And so they would go in and process all the sales records with their sort of screen to tell you what the Harvard parcels were. Well, if they shared that knowledge with, some of the community groups in Cambridge, that would have been really helpful. So it's the idea of sort of what are these processing tips that local knowledge brings to a data set, and then how do you process that and transfer that knowledge.
That's interesting.
So Nick, I'm looking at you with this one. I mean, the Civic Commons has a couple of apps up there. You have a marketplace for the idea of building tools that are openly shared, et cetera. What is there anything in that venue that shows you people sharing data in any particular format? Again, are we still going to have 3 apps that give you a JSON, one that gives you a CSV file, one that gives you an Excel spreadsheet, and one that gives you something in an Oracle dump file that nobody can open?
Yeah, I'm not going to solve that problem personally. This gets hashed out on a project by project basis, you know, and I don't know if I have the best answer. It happens according to norms, right? It's something we're dealing with in the Open 3-on-1 project where half the endpoints put out XML and half put out JSON because of their own restrictions, and we're trying to move them, but you can't just like tap a magic wand to make it happen.
Right. I happen to think that if you imagine that Weave is successful and becomes sort of a de facto visualization standard for lots and lots of data sets and databases, then automatically there's an interface, namely SQL queries that we require, and automatically people will write their data to that representation, put it in a database so that it's queryable, or in a spreadsheet in a standard way. And if you've identified some form of standard taxonomies for field naming, then you're way ahead of the game. Okay, we may not get to the ultimate solution, but at least you get far enough that people know that if they're going to put out a data set, then they have to put it out in a certain standard format.
Well, I guess, I mean, I was thinking back to the panel we had this morning talking about how numbers are important and narrative, and how this information, you know, and even, you know, each town produces information that is useful to everybody, whether it be at the parcel level or whether it be at, you know, the ownership of dogs across the city, you know, compared to poop rates across the city. You know, that kind of information, which over time is important to understand and important to use in policy, et cetera, and you know, journalism is the beacon that helps bring policy makers into the fold of some of this information that maybe they weren't aware of before. And I can't help but feel like we're still, you know, it's a real struggle.
Okay, so the best answer I can give is, I think, similar to what George was saying, which is that standardization processes are hard. If you were to say to everybody, hey, everybody, let's publish all our data in exactly the same way, let's do it, because it's the right thing to do, it's not going to happen. It's going to take forever, and you're going to get into like long, complicated conversations about the perfect way to do it. And when you look at recent efforts that have successfully catalyzed standardization, it always happens because there's some really powerful magnetic endpoint that everybody wants to be part of. So the best example is Google Transit and the GTFS specification for transit data, right? And Josh Robin got an award today because of this specification and other things, and Josh is the best. But the transit industry rallied around the GTFS spec because Google Transit, the website, existed, and they all wanted to be in that. And so that's my take on it, is that make some awesome app that everybody wants to play with and be part of, and then use that to drive standardization.
So that fear puts a lot of fear in my heart,
Sure.
only because then that puts the whole standardization or the ability to adjust standards at the application level, which then Google gets to decide.
Totally.
I mean, in KML, while it is a very useful tool for very quick sharing of geodata per se, it's not enough for most. You know, it doesn't carry projection. Let's just start there.
Sure.
You know, and projection for those who play with geodata is half the battle. So, you know.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's a perfect approach, but that seems to be how it works right now on the web. And
okay, the killer app will bring the data standard, is what you're saying.
That
But
frames
exactly
the challenge for Weave.
But
to
that's
become that
exactly
killer
what's
app.
happened in the past. If you look at technologies, you look at beta and VHS, not the best one won. And that occurs over and over and over again. I participated in ANSI and ISO standards committee way back in graphics, and I can tell you that none of the standards are visible to you anymore, even though I must have spent hours and hours and hours on them.
And that's basically the reason why JSON and GeoJSON is there, because it makes a lot of sense to a lot of developers to use data in this format. And there is a community-driven GeoJSON standard. The group puts together a document, okay, and we agree that's it, because it makes sense to us. And
so if you participate, for example, on Weave data specification, then you're going to help the Weave development early on to potentially adopt things that are very important. And that was the value of the consortium members. I'll give you an example, the projection one. I had never thought of projecting. What the devil is a projection doing around here? I had never built a GIS system. And MAPC and Christian come back and Sue and everybody just saying, wait, you got to project with different ones because Massachusetts doesn't look right and Atlanta doesn't look right when you look at it next to Massachusetts. So all of a sudden, the students are working out to work out the projections and on and like that. So without the participation of the community pointing out some of the things that need to be there, okay, the standard is not going to evolve in as broad a view as possible. So it behooves you to participate here, read, and make suggestions.
I guess in my imaginary world, I do understand that it's, the application, the users who drive the standards, right? Yeah. So if the users are over here at this application, that's the standard that people are going to use. And I can't help but think of the web battle over HTML, and now we're finally reaching this point where it's HTML5 and the standards are sort of, finally, it's going the other way around. It's not the developers at Microsoft and Mozilla designing a standard. It's the other way around. They're sort of creating these open HTML5 standards, and everybody's sort of playing fair, CSS and JavaScript. And I'm really hoping, I would love to see that little extra part, the geo HTML5 part that tells us what the standard is across the internet, because it's just, it's something clarifying that, So, but I feel, I understand what you mean.
We had a question over here. Yeah.
Well, it was actually more of a philosophical comment about this discussion. From my point of view, the whole history of the human race has been one of disagreement, contention, multiple languages, literally and metaphorically. So what needs to be explained is the emergence of standards and the emergence of coordination, like this fascinating assemblage of people who have quite different interests. And so this, I guess I'm just trying to echo Nick and Christian's observations that are, explain when it does happen, there are different explanations, and the default status is, noise. So just my humble opinion.
Well, on that note,
perfect from an MIT PhD to wrap it up.
I've been at a lot of conferences with Rob, and he always asks the hardest / most interesting questions. So thanks, Rob.
Since this is the actual end of Data Day, and I think it is, we're all, we're losing our crowd here. We'll wrap it up, and I would turn to Holly for any sort of final thought or wrap up or just goodbye or whatever.
Oh wow. Okay. It's been a long, great day, and I think thank you to all of our partners. We had such a great day today. I think we had such great experts and community members come together and learn together. So I just really want to thank everybody, and also I think this is only one example of experts and community members getting together and making something. So I think that there can be many more tools and visualization and data points and projects that happen like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.